All right, it's about that time. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Patrick Driscoll. I am with the education team here at 500. For the logistics of this webinar, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see two functions that can be used throughout the presentation. One is Q&A. Please use that throughout the presentation to incorporate your questions. You can ask whatever you'd like. We have time allotted at the end of the presentation to get to those questions. There's also a chat function, which you can feel free to use amongst yourselves. We will not be monitoring that function, so if you post questions there, keep in mind we will not actually get to them. And before I pass it off to the one and only Tanya, which is why all of you are here, I want to make a plug for our boot camp for Accelerator managers. It's an upcoming education program put on by 500 startups. It's located in San Francisco this year, and the dates, as you can see on the screen, are from the 22nd of October until the 26th. The link at the bottom of the screen, education.500.co/accelerator, is where you can find more information. Additionally, a link to apply. Essentially, this program is for accelerator managers and for all of those folks who are looking to start an accelerator, for corporates that are looking to expand their programs to incorporate acceleration for small business and startups. And we're looking at a global scale as well. So we want everybody to apply. It's a great program. This is one of our third iteration of the program, and it's been hugely successful in the past. And now I'll stop with the plug, and I'll get to the main reason why we're all here. I'd like to introduce Tanya Soman. She is a native New Yorker and is one of the youngest female to, well, she is the youngest female to make venture partner at 500 startups. She started working hands-on with companies in 2014 by coaching them through the Seed Accelerator program, and she now invests in consumer companies. And her specialty track within the Seed Acceleration program focuses on retail, beauty, and fashion verticals. And with that, I'll pass it off to Tanya. So take it away, Tanya.
Thank you so much. All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to get started today. So today we're going to talk about 5 tips for running an accelerator. Before we get started, I know you heard a little bit about my background, but just to give you some more information, I've been working with companies since batch 9, and in about just under a month, we are going to get started with batch 24. So I've seen quite a number of cohorts come through our program and have worked on different processes that are part of getting these companies into our accelerator. So everything ranging from due diligence and interviews to recruiting and actually working with them, post-program support, anything during post-financing rounds. So I'm really happy to answer any questions. But before we get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the main topics that we're going to cover. 5 tips. 1, we're going to talk about generating the best deal flow. As all of you know, for accelerators, generating deal flow is usually the biggest pain point because of the quality of deal flow that you are seeing. Capital has become extremely competitive, and because there's so much more of it in the market, founders have the opportunity to be picky with which investors they get to work with. So we're going to get to talk about that. Second point, interview companies at scale. So for many programs starting off, dealing with interviews isn't as troublesome because you are still fighting that chicken egg scenario of getting deal flow and then still going through companies. Now, with 500, we had a very similar approach. We were definitely not inundated with applications in the beginning, but more so looking for companies and did a lot of outbound work in the beginning for batch 1, 2, and 3. Our program was extremely different, and it only developed and evolved over the years because of branding. So we're going to talk about how we are currently processing interviews at scale and what you can do to also repeat the same best practices. So number 3, maximize growth for each company. Now, this is extremely important, especially because there are so many accelerators that have to figure out what their specific value add is. And companies need to know that before getting involved because they want to understand where their company will be at the end of your program. So this is something that we've also worked on over the past 8 years and kind of had to understand where is our strength and where can we help companies the most. So once you figure that out, you can then start selling and marketing your program to the right companies, and you can target the right people within the network who can refer those companies to you. And these might be people who are also helping them in a similar aspect, but want to refer them to a larger program. Fourth, manage expenses. So a couple of questions came in earlier about this and talking about, starting an accelerator is extremely costly. How do you balance profitability and expenses when getting started? So definitely agree here. I think overhead expenses are probably the number one biggest pain point that people face when starting an accelerator. So we'll go into a couple of ways on how we can make sure accelerator finances are sustainable and getting to V2 and V3 of the program. And last but not least, we are going to talk about growing community. So this is actually a very important tip for establishing an accelerator. When you're growing community, you are not only setting up something that's going to work for you in the future, but a lot of it happens organically in the beginning. Community exists and you need to just find it, and you need to find it depending on which people in your network are most active. So those are the high-level tips that we're going to be going through, and let's get started. So number one, generate the best deal flow. So for accelerators getting started, the number one high quality deal referrals are coming from founders and coming from mentors. So these are people that know what the accelerator program is, and really what that means is they know who you are. They know the people that are part of this program and can refer them because that's essentially all the trust they have to go with. It's very similar to founders who are raising the first round, maybe it's a pre-seed round, and they have no track record to go off of. So these founders are basically talking to investors who are betting on the founders themselves. And you're in a very similar situation here. When starting off the accelerator, you are basically going off of your word here. So there's no portfolio companies, there's no track record, especially because it's early on for other companies to look through. So you want to talk to founders that are in your network. Now, these may be founders you've helped. These may be founders you've personally invested in. These may be founders that you've known through a community that you're active in. So you want to understand who they are also talking to, and likewise mentors. So that might be yourself, that might be other people within the network. That's the obvious one. The not so obvious one for us were these outbound efforts that we really started working on in the past 3 to 4, maybe 5 years. And so I have email campaigns listed here, and it really all started with us looking at the deal flow that we were receiving. We posted applications and really worked on building brand. And so we directed startups to apply to our application online. At that time, we were running the program 4 times a year and just looked through applications which we received first on AngelList and then secondly through our own website. The problem here was that they determined the type of deal flow that we were receiving. We wanted to talk to companies maybe in a specific vertical or in a specific geography. Maybe we wanted to talk to more companies overseas or double down on the East Coast. And so what we did was put ourselves out there. So we first started with content when we were starting with these programs, our roadshows rather, and we wanted to get people to actually attend. We didn't want it to be a meet and greet. So we provided growth content. We provided tips for them on, one, getting into the 500 Startups Accelerator, so helping them navigate that process. And then secondly, helping them with their business. Because the one thing you have to remember is the busiest founders don't have time to go to an info session. And those are the founders we wanted to work with. But if we were providing value and providing valuable content, they were attending, and we could see that reflecting in the number of attendees that attended the events. So that's how we first started. As you can imagine, the events were great, but we had to keep up with all of the companies that we had met. So the second most important thing here is to find a CRM that you love and use it. Now, I will say the first part of that might be a little bit more difficult. No CRM is perfect. We went through a few and have landed on HubSpot. So it works for the majority of things that we need to do, and we're doing this at scale. So it's great, but there are a lot of other simpler solutions. At a minimum, make sure you're tracking the number of companies you're talking to, which founders you're talking to, where they're located, what the last contact was with them. It's very similar to a fundraising process, because the best deals that you get into are the ones that you have to chase. So that's what we had mainly focused on. And I think the second part of that was understanding what type of deals we wanted. So the same for you. When you're starting off the accelerator, you don't get to be as picky with the types of companies you're looking to work with, but you should have an idea of who you can help. Where can you be helpful? So is that a pre-seed? Is that seed stage? Is that Series A? And in that case, you have a more narrow focus on which companies you're trying to attract. So and to begin with, when you're starting off, not everyone has access to you. So you need to make sure that you make yourself available to other people. And we did this by putting ourselves out there. It did cost money, but I will say the first full roadshow that we did was the source for 21 out of, I think it was 45 companies in that batch. So it was definitely worth it. 2, interview companies at scale. So in the beginning, there wasn't really too much of a bottleneck in terms of interviewing companies. We had them apply, or maybe had invited them to, and kind of established this relationship with them, and it was easier to manage. Once we were getting applications in the hundreds and now thousands, we had to come up with a better process. I think it's really important to remember, you want to make sure you're reading every application, which we do. And so the first part of the process was establishing tiers. We needed to understand, we're not going to talk to every single one of these companies, but we will review them. So it was understanding certain things about the company that would help us determine if we wanted to have a proper interview with them. So let me tell you a couple of the things we look for in companies before we invite them to do an interview, and then I'll talk about the steps we have when interviewing companies. So for some of the things to look for, I think it's extremely important for them to have a full-time team. Our program is really designed to help the business grow, and they need to be 100% dedicated to that. So if they are not full-time yet, that's usually a sign that the company is too early for us. Number 2, cap table. So our deal flow is pretty international, and I think it's more common internationally, I will say, for there to be problems with the cap table. And this is important mainly because it affects downstream capital. So when you're looking at these founders cap tables, you want to understand, are both founders or all founders incentivized to be working at this company? Sometimes the equity is split very unevenly. And then the other piece is, how much of the business do the founders actually own? Many times before they've even raised a full seed round, investors own upwards of 40 and sometimes even 50% of the company, which is extremely problematic if they're trying to raise a Series A or a C+. A couple of other things we look at is where's the company incorporated? We just want to understand the timeline of how long it would take to actually invest with this company. And then some of the traction that we ask for is, revenue last month, revenue 2 months ago, revenue 3 months ago. And this gives us an idea of the growth rate for the company. So these are some things that we look for in order for them to get through to the first round of interviews. So let me talk about the interview schedule now. Once we receive applications, we start going through them immediately. So the sooner we can get started, the faster we'll be able to get through the several thousand applications. These are just reviewed online once we receive them, and they are in our CRM. So we use HubSpot for that. Each person on the investment team is looking at a different vertical or geography or a different area. So for instance, I look at all retail, beauty, and fashion verticals, but I also look at entertainment, I look at travel, I look at a lot of other consumer areas. Other partners on our team look at, the health tech vertical, we look at fintech, and there's a different person responsible for vetting those deals. Once companies have applied, you have the partner look through those applications and then select companies that they want to have a screening call with. The screening call is purely to understand if everything in the application is correct, if the business is actually viable, and kind of dig a little bit deeper into what they're working on. So that's essentially step one of the due diligence process. So after we have a phone call with them, the process has changed over the years. We used to actually have 2 screening phone calls to kind of balance the views, but now that we've specialized partners, we have them have one single phone call, and then they're moved to a group interview. The group interviews are extremely important. Now, the founder has sent an application, they've had a screening phone call with someone who knows their space well, and now they have a group interview. These are 2 back-to-back interviews with a room full of about 3 to 4 people in each room, and they're different people. The reason is because you'd be surprised at how differently a company might perform depending on the makeup of who is in that room. We prefer to meet these companies in person if they are local, but for any companies that are not in the Bay Area or international, we just talk with them over a video call. So that's really this process for what it's been like up until batch 23. What we're introducing in the upcoming batch is really talking about getting to know the founders better before we send them an offer. I think there's a lot of value in meeting founders in person, and unfortunately, that's not always the possibility. So what we've done this year is introduced a finalist workshop. And what this means is companies who make it to the final round are invited for a 3-day content kind of boot camp within the office at 500. So this is an opportunity for us to get to know the founders better and for them to get to know us. These things are going to tell, this activity is really going to tell us a few things. It's going to help us understand, are these founders, what their work ethic is like? Are they coachable? Which is extremely important because it reflects many things. It reflects how they'll perform in the program, and it also reflects how they will do while fundraising. And so I think that's an extremely important part of the interview process. One thing I'll quickly add after is not all companies will be a fit for you when they apply to your program. You might have companies that you think you want to invest in, but it's not the right time. Don't have any FOMO. You don't need to worry about that, but establish a relationship instead. Now, I'll caveat that and say if the deal is hot, and you will lose that deal if you do not invest, I think that is an example of an exception. But in our case, what we've done is add this note to the company within our CRM and say, we want to track this company. So many times companies have applied 1 to 3, sometimes even 4 and 5 times before getting accepted into the program. Now, you may think, wow, why are they applying so many times if they keep getting rejected? The point is, you need to give them good feedback, and relationships are extremely important here. Whenever we, send a no or a rejection to a company, we not only tell them that, but we also explain to them why we've passed on the company and what we would like to see if we're interested in working with them in the future. So make sure you're doing that. The founders really appreciate it, and it's you'd be surprised at how many companies they will refer to you because of the positive experience. Great. So 3, maximize growth for each company. this is really on the accelerators part. So you need to be clear about where you can help founders so they know why they should choose you. It's the same as talking to seed or Series A investors for founders. They need to understand what the value is, why they should be working this fund over another. And it's the same thing for accelerators. You need to establish what value you're adding to the company and have them, not only trust your word, but have examples. So when you work with certain companies early on in the program, track them, track the results and share them. So you might have to focus on a specific, maybe it's growth. For us, I'll take our example. We started off in a variety of different areas for our programming. We had, we were the accelerator that helped with it, help with growing your startup from design to hiring to growth to fundraising. And what that did was create a lot of work for us and a program that was helpful to companies more weeks than others, and in certain weeks more than others. And so what we did was boil it down to the two main areas that we were best at. So we were great at helping with growth. We had a team of marketers that were previously either CMOs or growth hackers at other companies who were working with our companies part-time or a couple times a week to kind of help them hit certain milestones. And so we doubled down there. We figured out what was working in the program and we started marketing that. So the same thing for your early stage accelerator. If you are starting off, figure out what, and this is something that you might even be able to ask people that aren't in your network. When you think of X, Y, and Z team, and this could be your own team, what do you think are the most, strong qualities or areas of expertise that come to mind first? And that's usually should be aligned with what your value add is. So the other piece is to track your results. The first batch might not be very large, and that's okay. But what you want to do is track those companies along and create case studies. You want to help them be able to show off the difference when they first started the program to post-program. Now, I think any program or accelerator for companies is going to be transformational. Something that is great content is even just when you're looking at the pitch of the company. So something to do is just record founders pitching their company on day one of the program and record them at demo day, right? Final day of the program, they're pitching to an audience of investors and whatnot, or press, and then look at the difference. And you can share that obviously with the founders, and if they're okay with it, with post on your social and kind of highlight the difference that your program is going to make. Which leads me to the last point, market your specialty. If people don't know what you're good at, they won't know why they should come to you. And I think it's important to also answer that question when people ask. For instance, a lot of founders ask us, why is 500 different to the other accelerators? And though it's extremely clear to us right now, we still have a couple of founders who ask the question, but it's important for us to share that information with them. So having a clear, concise, pitch yourself is really important. Manage expenses. So this was a question that is pretty popular for when starting off with an accelerator. So many accelerators have a tough time with this because overhead is extremely high. That's going to be the pretty much number one expense that you're going to have to deal with. So a couple of ways to kind of combat this is by securing sponsors, either a cash or partnership, and you might also want to figure out if you're going to be offering office space. So some programs, there are different types of programs, right? Some of them are just content. Some of them are also co-working. Some of them are in-house. So if you can get free or subsidized office space or free food to cut down costs, that is actually going to be pretty significant in helping manage finances. Overhead is going to be the most expensive for headcount. So I think creating the mentor network that's volunteer-based is also extremely important. So that's exactly what we've done with 500. Our mentor network is 100% volunteer-based, and our mentor quality is still very high. This is because we monitor it. It's not that anyone who wants to volunteer can just join. We still want to make sure our mentors are active. We want to make sure that they're high quality, and we want to make sure that they're helpful. So even though it is volunteer-based, we still kind of curate who is part of the network. Now, this is helpful because in the beginning, we would only have a limited number of people on staff. However, the mentor network, which was much more extensive and full of people who did want to work with other people within our network or within the portfolio, they were still accessible. So the other piece is keep the batch size low to start. Now, these programs really range in how they work with companies. Some of them are in-house programs, and the founders just work there up until a milestone and then they leave. For us, we do it in batches. So the batch starts on a certain date and it ends on a certain date. They're still within the network and the community afterwards, but it's more on a schedule. And so for us, we keep the batch, to start off, keep the batch size low. You want at least around 5 companies, but keep in mind the higher number of companies, the higher the cost will be. So there are different factors to toggle with in the beginning of the program or the beginning of the accelerator life. And another factor there is also length of program. Many programs start off as a 2 to 3 week boot camp. Some of them might start off as, a 3-month accelerator, but it really does change, one, how much time you have to be working with founders, and then 2, how expensive it's going to be. The last piece is really going to depend on how your accelerator is set up. And that's why I've asked this question here, are you investing? One factor is if the programs you guys are running are investing out of a fund, or maybe it's coming from a different source, it changes where your capital comes from. So if you're investing out of a fund, you do have management fees, and though they might not cover all of headcount, it's still a source of capital. Last but not least, grow community. So I think this part is extremely important here. Community exists, and I think without community, 500 wouldn't have as large of a footprint as we do. And obviously it didn't start off this way. So a community exists, you just have to find it. What do I mean by that? These are people within network. This is your core team and kind of the people that are active in your circle. So I think it's important to kind of collaborate with them, but then also try to grow the community while still participating in it. You don't want to establish a community that you are watching or managing. You want to be part of that because it allows people to know the community is active and to know that it is not beneath or above anyone to be part of it. Without writing about it, or as I write here, tweeting, articles, or invites, people don't know about the community. So it's the same thing. You have to talk about it, blog about it, and you have to connect the people within it. If you don't highlight what it's doing, community is not immediately self-aware. People don't just realize there's a community, even if they're deeply involved. You have to tell them again and again and again. So that's extremely important. And I think you also have to invite them. So make sure you are not only keeping the initial group of people exclusive, but more so adding new people and inviting others to join. There are a couple of ways to do this. The first one is with events, and I think a lot of accelerators do this. Now, this shouldn't be, to kind of just have a meet and greet, but actually provide content and fill gaps in between, what the accelerator is offering. Maybe it's a founder within the network that's extremely successful and it's a fireside chat. When we first got started, we would do fireside chats with, founders who had either just sold their company, and it was a off the record, just really informal conversation with the founders, and our entire founder base was invited to kind of network and talk to these people. So this helped bring awareness to what we were doing here and also invited more founders to participate. Now, all of these activities are great, right? Talk about it, write about a community. It sounds fluffy, but as long as you're consistent, that's going to be something that becomes reliable. So be fast. When people want to do monthly meetups don't sound that frequent, but they are. Time comes and goes, and you're right at the next one. So make sure you're consistent and you are on top of what you promise to deliver. Founders, when they hear a monthly meetup for consumer companies, for e-commerce, for B2B enterprise, they want to make sure this is something that's going to last. And so just be fast with getting it off the ground if there's an idea, and be consistent. I think that's really what helps people know this is something that's reliable and something that they can invite other people to without knowing it'll disappear. So with that, that's my last tip for starting an accelerator. And with that, I think we can open it up for Q&A right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanya. And we do have several questions that have come in. And just as a reminder, we are not monitoring the chat function, so please don't put your questions there. If you have put your questions in chat, please copy and paste them over to Q&A, the tab at the bottom of your screen. And for the first question, I'm going to start with some of the broader questions and then get down to the nitty-gritty specific ones. So Tanya, what exactly are you selling to sponsors when you approach them?
Great question. So what you're selling to sponsors, now this is going to really be tied to what you can help companies with. So depending on who your sponsor is, you want to sell them on the stage of the company and the vertical. So for instance, if you are selling to, it might be large companies who offer services. These companies might be in legal or in design or in accounting. Those were initial sponsors that we had. They are sponsors that are looking for deal flow, right? So they want to know that these companies, they get first access to the companies when they are pre-seed, seed stage. And once they've raised a round, they're going to look for a lawyer. They're going to look for designers. They're going to look for an accounting firm. And those are the people that they'll give a discount to. And that's how they start the partnership. Another way is to really figure out, what your thesis is. Maybe it's in biotech. And so there might be corporates who are interested in understanding what's happening in terms of innovation in that stage, in that space. And so you can sell them on early access to deals. The only thing I will say is with corporates, be careful about how much access you give, only because you want to manage that relationship as either a partnership or a potential LP if you are raising a fund.
Great. While you are structuring your accelerator, or when you're scaling up your accelerator and you're considering adding a fund, how would you set that up in terms of structure? And are there any resources that you recommend to look in on for this matter?
Yeah, so I think if I understand correctly, the question is really around, you've started a program and you are now trying to raise a fund to invest in these companies. How do I set that up? So I think it's the same process as if you were starting a fund traditionally. The only difference is you have a track record. So I think it's actually a pretty popular method that a lot of people have started doing. They've worked with companies and maybe even just taken equity in return for the actual program. This way they have a vested share in the companies that they're helping without actually having to deploy capital. And how to set that up. So I think a couple of things are are important when you're first talking to LPs. Number one is size of the fund. Size of the fund is going to determine a few things. How many people you can employ. It's going to determine headcount depending on management fees. Now, as I mentioned earlier, management fees are not going to be the only thing that cover headcount, but it's going to be a determining factor. The other piece is the size of the fund is also going to determine how many companies you can invest in. If you are writing 100K checks, that's about seed stage. If you're writing 500K checks, maybe you're going to lead rounds, and you need to figure out what your follow-on strategy is. So maybe you reserve 40 to 50% of capital for follow-on, and that's going to change the total number of first checks you can write, and will change how quickly you deploy that. So if that's a single fund, you want to make sure you can deploy over a few years. Sometimes it's 1 to 2 years, sometimes it's longer. And it's really it's creating a few models and figuring out which works best. So a couple of the factors to keep in mind: number of companies that will be going through the program, the size of the check that you want to invest. And that's a much deeper conversation in terms of what that valuation should be, how much equity you should be taking, but it's an important factor, and size of the fund. So I think those are 3 main factors. In terms of getting set up, you can talk to any of the legal firms. They're pretty good about setting up funds once you have all of those details fleshed out. So if you know what your thesis is, you know which geographies you want to invest in and where your LPs are going to come from, because that's going to affect how the fund is formed. Any of these law firms will be able to get you set up. So just make sure you have LP commits beforehand, because it will cost money.
Great. And now in terms of mentors, how would you recruit the best? What do you look for in terms of mentors, and do they need to be volunteers? What other incentives can you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I love talking about mentors, actually, because I think we are kind of always talking to people who could potentially be mentors, but how do we recruit the best ones? I think that's an important question, because we should be recruiting the best ones. A lot of times you have people that come to you and say, hey, I want a mentor, but the best mentors usually don't have enough time to mentor. So they need to be carving out that time to work with your companies. Now, if someone is looking to mentor full-time or looking to get paid for it, that's not really the person that you want working with the companies. So don't forget, mentors are going to help your companies, but you also need to guard them and figure out, are these mentors helping or just wasting time with the companies? A lot of the mentors, I won't say a lot, a few of them sometimes shop around companies to try and shop services, but what you want to do is establish a pretty clear and honest communication channel between the founders and yourself, so that they can tell you when that happens, because that's not the type of community you want to establish. But in terms of how to recruit the best mentors, I would figure out, and sometimes it's chicken egg scenario, right? You want to sell companies and say, hey, we have these mentors within network, but you also want to tell the mentors, hey, we want you to help because you're perfect for helping with XYZ companies in this space. So I think it's really about who your existing network is. You don't need to shoot very high in the beginning, and tell them, we're starting this program and they're going to be early stage seed companies. I know you've helped with, enterprise sales for early stage seed companies in the past. Would love to have you, maybe teach a course or something, or teach a session during our first program. And that's how you can get them involved. At a bare minimum, mentors can host office hours. Now, office hours are more intimate, they're one-on-one, but it kind of holds the mentor accountable and also gives them an opportunity to feel like they are actually working with more than, just 1 or 2 companies. And the last part of the question was, how else can they be compensated? Some firms might say, okay, this mentor can be compensated, or some companies might say, I want to pay this mentor. I don't believe that mentors need to be paid, because mentors should be working on something else full time. Some people, however, that are mentors do end up getting along really well with a particular company. And what comes from that is, they might be on their board, or they might be an advisor, or maybe they join that company. And I've seen that happen countless number of times, where a mentor joins as the VP of sales, or maybe they join to help them fundraise, or they become an advisor. And so that is something that needs to happen organically. But if it's promised beforehand, it's extremely fabricated, and it kind of, I think it breaks more often in that case.
In somewhat of the same vein, how can you attract entrepreneurs in residence, and what can you offer them as an accelerator?
Great question. So entrepreneurs in residence, I think these are people where, so first off, you need to make sure that they are actually in between gigs and working on something new in the beginning. The way to help them is they want to give back. They're still kind of playing around with what their next step will be. And so it's a home for them to work while still helping earlier stage companies, because they've already been a founder. Very similarly, in the same vein, I think this is also you can attract them because of your mentor network. So the mentors should really be, above an EIR, but the EIR should be able to be a mentor, but more hands-on with the founders. So that network isn't just going to be, execs or people who are operational. It can also include investors. And it doesn't matter how many times you're a founder, having access to those investors is still something that's valuable. So I think one easy way to attract EIRs is saying, we also have these investors coming in to work with our companies because they're interested in, pre-seed companies in X region. It'd be great for you to also connect with them while working with our companies, maybe do a lunch, maybe do a meetup. But it's more than just it's more than just telling them, hey, can you help companies, and hope that they like to do that.
Great. Thank you. And some quick ones. How about the 5 minimum for a batch size? Do you have any recommendations for an upper limit?
Great question. In my experience, the largest batch size that we've had was 51 companies, and I will say that was absolutely too many. I think the sweet spot is probably around 30 companies. Within the batch that was 51 companies, I think there were at least a handful I could think of that were probably too early for us and would have gotten a better experience if they had joined the next program or maybe the one after that. So I think 30 is probably the sweet spot, but it's still a high number. Yeah.
Great. And there are a few questions about this actually. In creating and structuring your accelerator as opposed to a venture builder, do you have any recommendations of incorporating venture building techniques in accelerators, or kind of vice versa?
So one more time, I think the question is, if you're structuring as just an accelerator, what are the tips if you're not structuring as a fund?
As a venture builder.
I see. So I think it's hard to say, because over time there have been really creative solutions for how people can incorporate. I think if you're not setting up as a fund, that's fine. But if you're helping companies, you still want to have a vested interest in them. And so I would still recommend figuring out some type of terms where you are getting equity in exchange for that program. Now that might be no capital and a few points of equity when they convert, and maybe that's something that's standard or maybe negotiated depending on the stage of the company. But you don't necessarily need to have a fund. But I think in terms of providing value, it's going to cost something, right? They can either pay for the program in cash or in equity.
Dokie. And now a little bit into the nitty gritty. For CRM, would you recommend starting with HubSpot or any other tech solutions for CRM management?
Yeah, so HubSpot is pretty good, but it does a lot of different things. When we first started, I mean, there were a couple. So Domo was one of them. I don't think it was quite the right fit for what we were looking for. Then we switched to Relate IQ, which is now Salesforce IQ, and and personally loved that CRM, but it's extremely expensive, and so it wasn't something that was worth it enough for us to spend the money on at that time. But I think Salesforce IQ is extremely clean, user friendly, really good experience there. With HubSpot, it's great. You probably won't use all of its functionality in the beginning because it's so robust. But if you're looking for a long-term solution, I think it's great. Like most divisions within 500 right now are all on HubSpot, and it serves the purpose for every single one of our teams.
Great. And now, in terms of time commitment, you mentioned full-time team. If you're starting an accelerator, would you recommend that the team become 100% full-time dedicated to the accelerator?
Absolutely. I mean, I think yes, I recommend teams that you're investing in within companies to be full time. And I think you need to set that example, right? So if this is your venture, this is what you're working on, you should be full time. So if you expect those founders to be full time, I think it's only right for the accelerator team to also be full time. And I will say, running an accelerator is extremely time consuming. Establishing that community means you are there with them. You are alongside in the office. The founders stay in the office all day and all night if you don't kick them out. And it really does allow them to kind of create this camaraderie. And so you want to be there for it. And I couldn't imagine having another job while being so hands-on with the accelerator companies. So definitely 100% full-time.
Great. And now for tracking the participants in the accelerator program, how do you recommend doing so for prior cohorts? How do you remain in contact with them? Is there any sort of software solution that you use?
Yeah, great question. If I'm being honest, it's something that we've experimented with quite a lot in the past at least 5 years. We were growing pretty fast at one point, and so it was pretty hard to keep up with the number of investments that we were making. It was pretty fast paced. But what we've done now is still update them through HubSpot. So what we do is send out an email campaign to companies and have them send us information if there's been a financing round. And so we can set those email campaigns up in HubSpot, and that information then gets populated to their profile within HubSpot. So we're still using that. I think finance probably extracts that information and uses it in their own system. But for our purposes of staying in contact with the founders, it's also divided up by which partner is responsible for companies in that vertical or geography. So for instance, companies in the retail space will get an email from me. It's an automated email saying, "Hi, we'd love to hear from you for your quarterly update. Please fill out this form." A couple questions that we ask are, have you raised a round since then? And then details about that, cash in bank, how much do you have left? And either burn or runway. And I think it's just a pretty short questionnaire if there hasn't been a financing round.
Great. And here's one about the applicants. Is traction really necessary to be considered to be part of the program?
Great question. I think traction is something that you look for in early stage companies because it's so hard to differentiate between them. I will say it's extremely dependent on the space. So there are companies that will not have traction, whatever you want to call it, for probably rounds, like several rounds, maybe up until Series A, Series B, seed or Series A, right? A lot of them in digital health might not be able to go to market until they get FDA approval, which is after their Series A round. So it will depend. Now, I think there are different benchmarks for traction depending on the space. So it's a popular question that founders ask all the time. They say, well, what type of traction are you looking for me to get into your program? And honestly, it depends. So I'll give a couple of examples because I know that's probably what the question's asking. For SaaS businesses, probably 10K in monthly revenue is what 500 looks for. For marketplaces, about the same thing. We know that marketplaces are extremely tough. So it's not necessarily about the volume, but more so about how they're doing acquisition for both sides. That's usually the tricky part, balancing it. For B2B enterprise companies, it's more about the sales cycle and the sales process. So if they've gone through an entire sales cycle, that's great. Even if it's amounted to one LOI or one paid pilot or one customer, and maybe they repeat or re-up with them, that's at a minimum what we're looking for. Whereas for e-commerce, which I see a lot of e-commerce, I'm looking at upwards of 80 to 100K in monthly revenue, monthly recurring revenue. So I think that's really going to depend. Whereas if you have some health companies or you have a lot of fintech companies, they're not making any money, but they'll be in the same cohort. So it really depends. I think traction can also mean a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily need to mean revenue. And so how you define that, just be clear to the founders of what that means.
Great. We have so many more questions, but unfortunately we're gonna maybe get to one or two more. And then I just want to let everyone know, if you'd like to follow up, feel free to email vcunlocked@500startups.com. And now a few more before we wrap up. Let's see. In terms of financial viability of an accelerator, Tanya, if these startups aren't going to exit for quite a long time, how can you balance structuring fees for startups to enter versus LPs? How did 500 do it, and what are your recommendations?
Yeah, so great question. This is a pretty standard problem for funds. Now, even though you won't have liquidity for any of these startups up until probably 7 to 10 years, in fact, our first IPO was only about a year or two ago, you can show the increase in portfolio or in valuation for your portfolio by tracking that, right? So number one, the fee of the program should be standard. It shouldn't change depending on how the portfolio is performing. It should really be tied to what's being provided. For 500, what we did was look at so 2 points here. One, we have all the investments tracked, and any additional funding or financing rounds with the new valuation, we were able to mark up the valuation in our books, right? Now, the one piece here is that there are many companies in the portfolio that actually are doing really well. They're, quote unquote, killing it or crushing it, but have not taken on additional capital. And unfortunately, we cannot mark those up because there has not been a new financing round. But in the case where there are new financing rounds, you can mark that up, and that's something you can sell to LPs, right? So that's number one. Number two, what a lot of fund managers do is something called like warehousing deals, right? So they take their own capital, and maybe they have some of their own angel investments that they've done prior to starting the fund. And what they do is they roll it into the actual fund. So that becomes part of the portfolio, and they now have a track record they can point to. And like I mentioned earlier, they can point to how much that company has raised, or what part of the market it has, or how that company's been performing. So I think program fees are separate to fund performance, but the other thing is your Fund 1 LPs are not signing up to be a one fund LP, right? They're really betting on you, and unless you've raised another fund in the past, they're really betting on the team, and they're pretty much signing up to be a Fund 1 and probably 2 LP.
All right, and now for the final question. I kind of like this as a transition to the end of the webinar. What is 500's goal for sharing their playbook with everyone?
I love this question because I actually forgot to talk about it. Yeah, our goal for sharing the playbook. So shameless plug, we do programs like Bootcamp for Accelerator managers, and that's really because this question has come up so much. How did you guys get started? What are best practices? How did you figure this out in the beginning, middle, and here? So it's definitely things like that. But I think in terms of how we help companies, we are extremely transparent about that. And I wanted to talk about it on one of our slides. I can't remember which one. It might have been maximize growth for each company. We, in fact, have a week that's probably week 1 or 2 for the batch, and it's called Marketing Hell Week. So what that means is it's a lot of content, probably 4 sessions a day for 5 days a week, and it's purely around growth. And so that gets the companies on the same page, kind of has them calibrated and helps us match them with the right point of contact to help them throughout the program. Now, this used to be our secret sauce. We would say, this is what you're getting with our program. And then we realized that's one piece of a much larger program that we offer, and the much larger part of what we offer is also community, which you're not going to get by just accessing that content. So we're pretty transparent about it. If there's any questions about anything in particular or specific, we're pretty open to answering, but you can also find all of that content on growth.500.co. So all of that is what we also use to kind of act as a teaser for companies we want to work with. So there are some companies where we say, hey, you guys are early for us, but we really like to work with you next time, or when you hit XYZ milestone. In the meantime, check out our Marketing Hell Week content on growth.500.co, and you'll get an idea of why we think you're too early. Because founders love to push back when you tell them that they're too early, but once we have this content, we say, look, you can actually execute on half of the things we're talking about. So that's why the timing's not correct. So to answer your question, how do we want to share our playbook? We're pretty transparent about it. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer specifically. But again, we cover a lot of this content for accelerator managers in BAM, and then for fund managers who don't want to who don't want to establish an accelerator, we actually have them have a program for VC Unlocked, which allows them to kind of understand how we set up funds and establish thesis and all of that. So it's twofold, but we cover most of it there.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Tanya. And
great.
With that, one final shameless plug for BAM. Again, it's on your screens, but this is a great program, as Tanya just described, that will really get into the nitty-gritty of how to run an accelerator, how to figure out what your superpower is as an accelerator. We get into more technical aspects about how to model your accelerator for fees and for the length of your accelerator, and kind of how to strategically decide what to do. And we have some great mentors that are going to come in to lead sessions from 500 and from outside organizations. And the website is at the bottom, education.500.co/accelerator for more information. The application is also available there. All of this will be shared with the participants of this webinar afterwards, along with a recording of the webinar and some more information about 500. So with that, I'm going to close it out. I want to say thank you so much to Tanya for offering up your time, and to all the participants for taking place. Any final words, Tanya?
No, thank you so much. I'm happy to connect offline if anyone has any other questions. My email was on there. I'm just Tanya@500startups.com. But thanks so much for joining.
All right, thank you, everyone. And that is